Good evening, everyone. It is after 7, and so we're going to get started. I have no idea how many people are online or how many more people are coming, but I'm deeply thankful for those of you who are here. I just said to Dr. Teresa, this is literally our first time back in person in a public gathering. So I think we're all relearning how to be in public with one another again. So on behalf of our president, Jay Rundell, Reverend Jay Rundell, who's sitting in the back, wave, and the faculty and staff of MTSO, I am glad to welcome you to this particular Williams Institute lecture. It is my express pleasure to welcome somebody that I consider a friend to this. The Williams Lectures were started in 1981. Okay, where did my little note go? Try not, and why am I reading without my glasses? Okay. The Williams Institute Lectures were begun in 1981 to honor the late Dr. Ronald L. Williams, who's a professor of theology here at MTSO from 1971 until his death in 1981. The Institute has featured speakers from many backgrounds, including theologians, ethicists, poets, biblical scholars, historians, pastoral psychologists, and Christian educators. And we are thankful to add Dr. Teresa Delgado's name to a long list of really star quality professors who have spoke in this institute. So I want you to welcome her, but let me introduce her before you welcome her with your clap. Dr. Teresa Delgado, I'm reading from St. John's page about her, St. John's University page about her, but I got stories. I'm not going to tell any of them, but I'm just going to read what they say. Dr. Teresa Delgado is the Dean of St. John's College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and she is Professor of Theology and Religious Studies there at the University in New York. She received her doctorate from Union Theological Seminary in New York under the guidance of the trailblazing womanist theologian, Dr. Dolores S. Williams. She has published on topics ranging from decolonial theology, diversity in higher education, transformational pedagogies, constructive theology and ethics, and justice for racially, ethnically, and sexually minoritized persons, including essays like Metaphor for Teaching, Good Teaching is Like Good Sex, which was in Teaching Theology and Religion in 2015. Don't you want to read that? Beyond Procreativity, Heterosexuals Queering Marriage in Queer Christianity's Lived Religion in Transgressive Forms, published in 2014. Her book, The Puerto Rican Decolonial Theology, Prophesy Freedom, was published in 2017 by Palgrave Macmillan. And she co-authored with Dr. Victor Anderson, iconic professor his own self, at Vanderbilt University, For the Beauty of the World, the Moral Imaginary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s World House, which was included in Reclaiming the Great World House in the 21st Century. Her poetry has been included in collections, and she has addressed the need for diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education, serving as a mentor for students of doctoral students of color. She's a senior fellow of the Ford Foundation. She has served on the board of the Hispanic Theological Initiative, which I think is where we first met at one of those gatherings at AAR, one of the best of their nighttime gatherings. The advisory committee for the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning in Theology and Religion. She's been involved with the Forum for Theological Exploration and currently serves as a member of the Board of Trustees at Colgate University and the Ursuline School. I mentioned some of her publications. I won't go further into them, but I would ask you to Google her so that you know her. Please help me welcome to MTSO, Dr. Teresa Delgado.
And while you put yours on to read, I take mine off to read. It is really an honor and privilege to be here with all of you. It was a bit harrowing getting here, I have to say, even for a New Yorker. But I'm very, very happy to be here among you today. It really is an honor and privilege. This is my first time in Ohio, actually. Rather than just passing through to get to Michigan, where my daughter went to school. So I'd like to begin first by acknowledging the indigenous land here of the original inhabitants of Ohio, the Erie, Kickapoo, and Shawnee, forced to migrate elsewhere after broken treaties. Specifically, the 1795 Treaty of Greenville, the forced removal of the Potawatomi, Delaware, Miami, Peoria, Seneca, Wyandotte, Ojibwe, and Cherokee tribes through the Indian Removal Act of 1830. I extend this profound respect for the first peoples of this nation and the treaties that were made on this territory, as well as my remorse for the harms done and the promises broken in the past and in the present. And I share this because I'm committed to working with my Indigenous brothers and sisters in solidarity and collaboration. I'm committed to accountability. So my recognition of the first peoples of this land is my small effort to assert the importance of our context for accountability. Our context matters for our theology, to our ethics, to our ability to build these communities of accountability and solidarity and belonging. And as MTSO, to provide theological education and leadership in pursuit of a just, sustainable, and generative world. If nothing else, theologies begin where we are and where we have been. And that context cannot be fully understood without accounting for the borders and the boundaries that have shaped and circumscribed it. The title of my talk this evening is Teaching Borderlands in the Midwest: Border Logic, Border Thinking, and Accountability. So I begin with where we are, here in the Midwest context of Ohio. And I have been particularly attuned to this final stretch of the 2022 political campaign season. And I've watched the debate between Tim Ryan and J.D. Vance with great interest, particularly around the issue of immigration. The contrast between the two is notable, to be sure. And at the same time, I've observed an interesting dynamic common to both. Whenever the topic of border crossing comes up, usually themes like safety, crime, and legality are not far behind. Why is that? Especially when the reality challenges such conflation. According to a 2020 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, I quote, "Undocumented immigrants have substantially lower crime rates than native-born citizens and legal immigrants across a range of felony offenses. Relative to undocumented immigrants, US-born citizens are over 2 times more likely to be arrested for violent crimes, 2.5 times more likely to be arrested for drug crimes, and over 4 times more likely to be arrested for property crimes." For Ohioans, a more accurate assessment of immigration may be useful, particularly if you are to consider the need for farm workers and the share of foreign-born employees working in the much-needed area of semiconductor and microchip manufacturing. According to a Brookings Institute report published earlier this year, quote, highly skilled immigrants could provide a substantial amount of this expertise immediately and could help retrain the domestic semiconductor workforce at the same time. This same report cites Intel's plan to invest more than 20 billion in the construction of 2 leading-edge chip factories right here in Ohio, but notes that the nation's percentage of foreign-born workers in the chip industry, which is around 10%, is twice that of Ohio. In other words, if Ohio is going to staff these factories, it will need more workers, and immigration could alleviate that labor crunch. That's the immediate context. That is where we are. As a starting point for exploring border logics, border thinking, and accountability, particularly in theological education, I ask you to situate yourself in 3 other moments of where we have been in recent memory. The first, in Charlottesville, Virginia, on August 11th, 2017. The second in Puerto Rico on September 20th, 2017. And the third at our nation's capital on January 6th, 2020. First, to Virginia. As I'm sure many of you can recall, a Unite the Right rally was held on August 11th, 2017 in Charlottesville, Virginia, which included a tiki torch march on the campus of the University of Virginia, culminating at the statue of its founder, Thomas Jefferson. The nighttime rally was followed the next day by another gathering, this time met with even more protesters than the previous night, including religious rights, civil rights leaders, and religious leaders who were there to counter the white supremacist message and presence in their community. According to a 2018 report by the Anti-Defamation League, quote, almost every segment of the white supremacist movement was represented in Charlottesville that day. In addition to many people being injured in violent clashes between white supremacists and those protesting against them, Heather Heyer was killed when a white supremacist used his car as a weapon to barrel into a crowd of protesters on 4th Street, which is now named Heather Heyer Way. And at least 20 others were injured in that same attack. White supremacist violence has been on the rise since 2015, and most recently, FBI Director Christopher Wray has stated that, quote, racially motivated violent extremism, mostly from white supremacists, has made up a majority of domestic terrorism threats. Just shy of a month later, that same year, Hurricane Irma barreled through the Caribbean as a Category 5 hurricane, with its initial land impact on September 6th until it dissipated about a week. Even though reports spoke of Irma just skirting past Puerto Rico's northern shore, it still wiped out electrical power for over 1 million residents and wreaked havoc, destruction, and death on many Caribbean nations, including Barbuda, which was left virtually uninhabited. For Puerto Rico, this was merely the warm-up act to the headline. Hurricane Maria ripped through the island as a near Category 5 hurricane with sustained winds of 155 miles per hour. Its eye passed directly over the 100-mile-long island territory, damaging virtually everything in its wake and further exacerbating the damage done by Irma just 2 weeks prior. Since the hurricane made landfall in the early morning hours of September 20th, many Puerto Ricanos, including myself, did not sleep at all that night. And if we did, we awoke to the devastating reality the storm was inflicting as its eye cut the island in half. A Harvard study published by the New England Journal of Medicine in 2018 estimated the death toll of 4,645, 70 times higher than the official death count. I share these 2 moments because they are inextricably linked by what I will call the border logic of white supremacy. Its past, its perpetuation, and its persistence. And these moments help us to see with greater clarity how this same border logic mobilized an insurrection at our nation's capital on January 6th. Indeed, white supremacy is woven into every fabric of this country. If we're honest about our intention to dismantle white supremacy as our nation's foundational border logic, the dividing demarcation line operative within all the institutions it houses, including our theological institutions, then we need to face the truth about that history. If we weren't ready to face that history before, the violence in Charlottesville, the violence of Hurricane Maria, and the violence of January 6th have made it increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to unsee what we have seen. What do these moments reveal to us? Both Charlottesville and Hurricane Maria laid bare the realities of racism and colonialism, twin siblings of white supremacist parentage, the operative border logic of our nation's founding. Both events stripped away the protective barrier that had functioned to obscure to some, surely not to all, the deep infected wound laying beneath the surface, growing and spreading in varying degrees for 5 centuries. And that infected wound, in all its raw and flaming heat, swelled in full display at the Capitol last year. Let me go back to Charlottesville. The home of the University of Virginia, Charlottesville is where slavery was a powerful force shaping politics, economics, and everyday life. It's no mere coincidence that the organizers of the Unite the Right rally decided to march to the statue of Thomas Jefferson. As University of Virginia alumni, they claimed him as their own because he was one of their own. The role of the university, in Jefferson's own words, was to preserve the Southern way of life for the Southern man. Jefferson wrote to his friend James Breckinridge in 1821, expressing his concern with sending the youth of Virginia to be educated in the North, which he called a place against us in position and principle. He worried that in Northern institutions, young Virginians might imbibe what he called opinions and principles in discord with those of their own country. This canker is eating on the vitals of our existence, he said, and if not arrested at once, will be beyond remedy. The veil of civility and intellectualism that has come to characterize the university, education it promotes, was torn away by the march and its aftermath to expose the monstrous nature of racism ever present, built into its very walls, seeped into the very soil of its foundation, inscribed on its monuments, and constructed by those enslaved by its founding benefactors, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, whose wealth was acquired by human bondage of Black people. The Unite the Right March was yet another marker that made explicit the connection between the Virginia landing of ships bearing human cargo to be sold in 1619, the enslaved labor that financed and literally built the University of Virginia 2 centuries later in 1817, and Charlottesville in 2017. Racism is the connective tissue, the border logic binding together white supremacy. And what has Hurricane Maria revealed to us? Similarly, it tore back the veil of the crumbling effects of a colonial project, first by Spain and then since 1898 by the United States. For Puerto Rico, the veil of progress and democracy as a free associated state was torn away by 2 consecutive hurricanes to expose the truth about the last colony of West Indies. Taken by Spanish conquistadores in the late 15th century, and bolstered by the doctrine of discovery articulated in the papal bulls of 1452 and 1493, Puerto Rico became a valuable asset, and it didn't take long for Spain to create a weak and dependent ward. As a colonial outpost, Puerto Rico's economy was in an unhealthy state by the early 1800s, given the many trade restrictions imposed upon it by Spain to limit any production that would compete with products from Spain. Very little, if any, profit was reinvested in the island, except in areas where it bolstered the domestic supply of goods necessary to produce those exports. After over 250 years of Spanish rule, the island had no real infrastructure or industry. However, Spain was not about to relinquish its hold on Puerto Rico so easily, because it was for Spain a strategic outpost of empire, the cockpit of the Caribbean defense system, so that its civilian aspect was altogether subordinated by its military significance. That was the way that Gordon Lewis spoke of Puerto Rico in his book in the 1960s, Puerto Rico, Freedom and Power. Then entered the United States in 1890. Under the banner of democracy and rationalized by Enlightenment ideals, the U.S. took Puerto Rico along with Cuba and the Philippines as spoils of the Spanish-American War. The next century of U.S. colonial rule brought with it the complete destruction of subsistence agriculture, the influx of development and industry, while maintaining complete dependence on U.S. legislation without Puerto Rican representation. While I could spend this entire session demonstrating to you how the United States underdeveloped Puerto Rico, suffice it to say that the Great Recession of 2008 spiraled Puerto Rico into an economic nosedive that had already begun a decade earlier, to the tune of a $72 billion debt crisis, which some scholars have called odious, and for which austerity measures were enacted by congressional legislation in 2016. Named Promesa, which stands for the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, the austerity measures imposed by this legislation include the reduction of social services, reduced minimum wages, and an oversight committee with minimal representation of Puerto Ricans. Passed in bipartisan fashion in both the House and the Senate, signed into law by President Obama, Promesa ensures the hedge funds that finance the debt will undoubtedly. All of this history of the denial of humanity, of ascribing second-class citizenship, of not being able to access humanitarian aid and supplies because of the Jones Act, was brought into sharp relief after Hurricane Maria. Like Charlottesville, the aftermath of this hurricane was yet another marker that made explicit the connection between Columbus's landing of conquistador ships in 1493, the genocide, human subjugation, and economic crippling initiated by Spain and then continued by the United States 4 centuries later, Hurricane Maria in 2017. Colonialism is the connective tissue, the border logic binding together rights. So let me turn now to what I call the ways in which this swelled in as an infection, as its raw and flaming heat on January 6th. And I'll just quote a phrase from a Puerto Rican writer who has spoken to me in so many ways, Rosario Ferre. One of her writings, she warned that whatever is suppressed will reemerge with vengeance. And so did it ever on January 6th. It's hard to describe how I felt as I watched the horror that unfolded on what has been in every other instance a benign, pro forma, uneventful C-SPAN occasion certifying state election results. Perhaps one way to describe it would be cognitive dissonance, seeing what's happening before me and not really believing my own eyes, questioning how is it possible that this could be happening, seemingly without any police or military resistance for hours, And at the same time, what I witnessed did not surprise me at all, including gallows erected on the Capitol grounds, Confederate flag, the Capitol Rotunda, T-shirts blazoned with Camp Auschwitz, white power hand gestures of the Boogaloos and Proud Boys, Civil War January 6 shirts to commemorate the date long awaited by far-right white supremacists, co-opted Norse mythology as symbols of deified whiteness, and thousands upon thousands of people permitted to just go home after desecrating the People's House. While there's still so much to be learned about that day, we can say this for certain, that January 6th is yet another marker on the continuum of white supremacy in this country, a deep foundational architecture forged on the soil of the Capitol grounds, seemingly stronger than its sandstone walls laid in place by the enslaved labor scripted for its construction. In the face of this reality, of seeing what we cannot see, how can we be accountable for this story, which is our story, here in this context, in theological education? Latin American theologian John Sobrino, Salvadoran Jesuit priest, activist, proposes 3 prerequisites for a genuine and concrete spirituality of liberation, which I believe can be upheld as prerequisites for a genuine concrete theology. First, being honest about the real, a willingness to look the contradictions squarely in the eye and confront the ugliness of our situation with hope. Second, fidelity to the real, a recognition that faithfulness to eradicating those contradictions will lead to carrying a burden of love that those who choose to escape from reality do not show. And third, participating in the more of reality, a willingness to be an active player in the building of a more just society, which is our ethical mandate to strive towards the ought to be. For Sobrino, a more just society is one that understands and tries to live out a profound notion of freedom. Theological education that does not reinscribe the border logics that I just described as a resistance to white supremacy must also embody liberating action while maintaining the requisites that speaks of. This space of resistance or living in the boundary of a fidelity to the real, that is what is, and the participation of the more of reality, or what ought to be, seems to me what philosopher Walter Mignolo speaks of when he upends the Cartesian formula and instead affirms, I am where I think. I am where I think. He asserts the necessity of thinking from a space of contradiction. And I'll quote him, where he says, to dwell in and think from the borders. Border thinking becomes then the necessary epistemology to delink and decolonize knowledge, and in the process, to build decolonial local histories, restoring the dignity that the Western idea of universal history took away billions. Now, there's an important distinction that I'm trying to make here between border logic and border thinking. Border logic is the static line carved into the land, pierced into our bodies, established within our epistemologies, including our theology, that sets apart one from the other, that creates binaries of us and them. The border logic of white supremacy takes it one step further, delineating power, prestige, privilege to whiteness, and the lack of these to variations of blackness. Border thinking, on the other hand, exposes the insidiousness and harm of border logic because it reveals its ulterior motive, its underbelly, and its artificiality that is based on benefit, including its need to be propped up on the backs of those who continue to bear its scars. Chicana writer Gloria Anzaldúa describes this distinction better than I. And I'm going to quote a lengthy piece from her book, Borderlands, La Frontera, The New Mestizo. The US-Mexican border es una herida abierta, where the third world rates against the first and bleeds. And before a scab forms, it hemorrhages again, the lifeblood of two worlds merging to form a third country, a border culture. Borders are set up to define the spaces that are safe and unsafe, to distinguish us from them. A border is a dividing line, a narrow strip along a steep edge. A borderland is a vague and undetermined place created by the emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. It is in a constant state of transition. The prohibited and forbidden are its inhabitants. Los atravesados live here. The squint-eyed, the perverse, queer, troublesome, the mongrel, mulatto, the half-breed, the half-dead. In short, those who cross over, pass over, or go through the confines of the normal. Gringos in the US Southwest consider the inhabitants of the borderlands transgressors, alien, whether they possess documents or not, whether they're Chicanos, Indians, or Blacks. Do not enter. Trespassers will be raped, maimed, strangled, gassed, shot. The only legitimate inhabitants are those in power, the whites and those who align themselves with whites. Tension grips the inhabitants of the borderlands like a virus. Ambivalence and unrest reside there, and death is no stranger. Rosario Ferre speaks of this border logic through the battle of language. Her poem, Language Duel, exposes the damage and absurdity of either or. And I'll read the extent of her. Why is it that in the year of our Lord 2001, Americans have such a difficult time learning Spanish? Because of E pluribus unum, because of the Civil War, because Catholicism and Protestantism, because papists and anti-papists, because La Leyenda Negra, which left King Philip II of Spain tarred and feathered in his underwear, sitting on the devil's rump. I have a surprise for you. It's for none of these reasons. English and Spanish have been at war since Queen Elizabeth sank the Spanish Armada in 1588. Language carries with it all their fire and power. It's still feuding in Florida, Puerto Rico, and California. In fact, I swear that as I talk to you in English about my right to speak in Spanish, I can hear the guns boom and see the cannonballs roar over my head. Not to take advantage of the double perspective and run full speed ahead down parallel rails seems a pity, but there's nothing to be done. Two male crabs can't hoot the same layer. How do we envision a future where white supremacy is dismantled, and employ theological values toward that goal. In other words, employ border thinking in a way that does not reinscribe racist and colonial border logics at this moment in our country and our world. Christianity and border logics have been intricately intertwined for over 500 years, at least as manifested in the Western Hemisphere and within the epistemologies of modernity. But let's not kid ourselves. If we are interested in being a community based on love, in pursuit of a just, sustainable, and generative, and therefore agents in dismantling all that impedes love and justice, including white supremacy, then we must become border thinkers and doers as theological thinkers. What does that mean? First, we must look to the borders of our own categories. Let's examine again the words of Walter Yolo. This is the basic condition of border thinking. The moment you realize and accept that your life is a life on the border, and you realize that you don't want to become modern because modernity hides behind the splendors of happiness, the constant logic of reality. Precisely this reason, border thinking that leads to decoloniality is of the essence to unveil the system of knowledge, beliefs, expectations, dreams, and fantasies upon which the modern colonial world was built and is showing, will continue to show, its unviability. In some ways, Charlottesville, Puerto Rico, and January 6th have already done the work of decoloniality in that they have unveiled the system of knowledge, beliefs, expectations, dreams, and fantasies upon which our vision of the world has been built. These moments have exposed the underlying border logic of white supremacy hidden behind a veil of democracy. And we cannot unsee what we have seen. Second, we must encounter those spaces of knowledge and meaning that we don't necessarily claim as theological or finished. Here, I'm inspired by the work of Reverend Dr. Brian Massengale, who has engaged the wisdom of James Baldwin, Malcolm X, and other perhaps non-traditional sources to develop, for example, a Catholic moral theology that attends to race, racism, and white supremacy. He asks why Catholic moral theology hasn't addressed racism with the same rigor and analysis as it has addressed, for example, war, poverty, and has concluded, and I have to agree with him, that the categories of Catholic moral theology do not excavate the ground upon which one's moral development is situated. In other words, Catholic moral theology has fixed its eyes upon that which has grown out of the soil and disregarded the toxic soil that has produced and reproduced that growth. But if white supremacy has revealed anything, it has also shown us that no new foundation can be built without first attending to the quality and integrity of the ground upon which that foundation is situated. Ground, water, everything within it is toxic. How can we expect anything that grows from it to be anything but toxic, including our theologies? Decolonial border thinking compels us to affirm that I am where I think. Being emerges from one's situated place, one's context. It is not divorced from it in some abstract sense. Theology, our thought and our discourse about God must also derive from such a context that is intentionally and explicitly situated in a non-white supremacist space. Third, we must challenge the singularity of mono authorities, including that of the Christian church, not because we don't believe that there is a truth that is universal, but because we know that truth is manifest in different ways. For any Black and brown person, this is not an intellectual argument, but a matter of life and death, the ability to survive and thrive. Why is it so hard for us to hear, or importantly, to believe, for example, when Black people tell us their truth? Why do we only seem to believe it, if we do at all, when it's caught on videotape with corroborating witnesses? Why do we think for a second that what happened to Patrick Moya, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor, Philando Castile, or Donovan Lewis right here in Columbus, Ohio, is new? Why are we so shocked? Racism is not getting worse, it's getting filled, claimed a recent tweet. When we listen to those on the borders and hear their truth as truth, even when, and especially when, it doesn't align with what we experience as truth, we begin to, as Mignolo asserts, dwell in and think for the worse. We must apply the same method to our theology, because when we do not, we silence the border dwellers. In Anzalua's words, silence, squint-eyed, perverse, fear, troublesome, awful, black, half breed, half dead, and are complicit, perpetuating their silence. And in doing so, we maintain the logics of white supremacy. Finally, we must engage in an ethic of decolonization by attending to the ways we can imagine and reimagine community, indeed the flourishing of all, the common good of the planet, aspiring toward a decolonial future that is to come. Theological education requires of us, employing Sobrino's categories again, to be honest about the real, a willingness to look at white supremacy and its siblings, racism and colonialism, squarely and confront their ugliness with hope. It requires of us to be faithful to the real, to see and hear the truths from the borderlands and commit to carrying the burden of that truth with courage, and to participate in the more of reality, to put everyone's body on the line, to love out in the streets as one would love in private, to be an active player in the building of a more just society. A decolonial future and a theology that imagines it as an act of resistance to white supremacy must embody liberating action. As those involved and engaged in theological education, we are here in Ohio, miles away from the US-Mexico border, miles from the border, Puerto Rican status. Yes, even though there is no direct encounter physical border, we are no less immune to the devastating effects of border logic right here. How do we inscribe and reinscribe border logics that serve as dividing lines of demarcation, of solidifying us and them, those who are in and those who are out, erecting walls, fences, cages even, to keep and maintain some illusion of safety by shutting others out, right here in the midst. border thinking provides a way for us to resist the border logic of white supremacy. And the gospel of Jesus is a testimony to border thinking. But more on that tomorrow. We're faced with the decision to be accountable to the context in which we live, to be accountable to those with whom we live in these borderlands we have created wittingly and unwittingly. We cannot unsee what we have seen. Now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been. 1 Corinthians 13. Let me partner this Corinthians text with a quote from one of the great literary prophets of the 20th century, James Baldwin, whose words continue to haunt me, that they were written in 1916. I don't envy any white person in this century. I wouldn't like to have to face. Don't face it though. It's a matter of your life or death. It's a matter of whether or not you want to live. All that can save you now is your confrontations, your own history. Thank you for your willingness to hear my musings from the borderlands as a Puerto Rican diaspora theologian. I look forward to our conversation.
Would you thank Dr. Delgado one more time? These lectures are intended to be conversation starters, and there are microphones in the aisles. If you have a comment, reflection, or question, don't do it from your seat, go to the mic. Are there any questions to Dr. Delgado or reflection on what you have heard? I got lots, but I'm not the person that should talk. And we'll wait, take some deep breaths. That was heavy. A friend of mine would say, you walked heavy up in here.
I'm going to pass on this.
And I'm glad you didn't. I'm glad you didn't. You gave us a lot. You gave me, you gave me a lot to think about. And if you saw me, I was taking copious notes because I learned tactically. I have to write to maintain stuff, but I'll also go back and watch this lecture a few times. Any reflections, questions to the mic? Jeremy and then Cal.
Thank you, Dr. Delgado, for that reminder to think from borders. What I was struck by when you were talking about the hurricanes, particularly, was that those weren't accidents or natural forces either way. Those were the product of climate change and increasing weather problems. And that's related to border logic too, right? Climate change and colonialism. What are some ways that we could think about climate change and how it's affecting the world in border logic and border thinking kind of ways?
Thank you very much for that question. I appreciate that because the way that I would describe the climate crisis as a reflection of a ongoing border logic is separating, and the fact that it's affecting certain communities more so than others in very particular ways, speaks to the hierarchy of anthropocentrism within our society, and I would say even within our traditional Christian thinking, that somehow the human person stands above. When I've taught undergraduate students the story of, the book of Genesis in relation to, unpacking and understanding the theological roots of the climate crisis. It is, we hone in on words like dominion and subjugate, and how that has really seeped into our consciousness. So yes, I agree that the current climate crisis is a example of the effects of border logic. And so how do we then use borderland thinking to undo the damage that has been done? I would say first that we need to see ourselves and all of the inhabitants of this planet and the planet itself as a border. And the transition that is happening within that border is requiring our intervention. But we don't do it alone, because the border logic was created by humans attempting to subdue and subjugate, and we won't undo it with that same kind of thinking or intervention. It requires then that we look to the creaturely inhabitants of our planet. They are giving us signals of what we need to do and what not to do. We also need to look to those traditions, the spiritual traditions that have been attending to this for way longer than we have, perhaps, as Christians. Our indigenous communities that have been dwelling in harmony with the planet and sounding that alarm for longer than we have been interested in it. So yes, I think that there's a lot more that can be said there, but I do agree that border thinking requires greater collaboration, not just with us as human beings, with all the inhabitants of our planet and the planet itself. The planet is speaking to us, and that we should start to listen. Thank you for the question.
Dr. Delgado, I couldn't help but think of how border logic exerts a force even on the historical study of religion itself. And I'm interested in what that means for, one, how we just practice our scholarly work, our study, and what sorts of reinvention or reimagination. I mean, certainly we're seeing how market forces have pushed a lot of colleges, universities to rethink even the existence of these programs of study, and certainly theological education institutions also having to reinvent themselves and apply a new kind of border thinking. So I'm just interested in how just our scholarly trajectory and academic traditions require some new thinking and imagination.
Well, thank you for that question. If I may, I'd like to touch upon the process of scholarly formation that is exhibited through the granting of doctorate, as an example. So even in the most progressive institutions, that is institutions of theological education that are really expanding the notion of boundaries, there is still a process at, I would say, it is a 18th century process of how one obtains that degree. There are certain, there's a certain canon that's required, certain fields of study that are absolutely necessary. Them, I'm sure, right? We've got the Bible, we've got church history, we've got systematic theology. You have a certain number of what are considered those comprehensive exams that stress a whole lot of people out. Work with doctoral students all the time, and that is such a stressful period. And then it's like running through a gauntlet, jumping through hoops in order to just check that box to get to the next step. Why do we do it that way? Why do we do it that way when our bodies tell us that that process is harmful? Even in the most progressive of institutions, continue to do it that way. I don't really understand. Well, I should say that. I understand why. So that, let me walk that back. Because it is not easy. In fact, it almost feels as if to do so would be to pull out the bottom card on the house of cards, and all of it will fall. Why do we not trust the power of theology in itself enough to trust that it will get us there without having to go through those steps? So what I think needs to happen within theological education is to put in place the kinds of structures that are aligned with the kind of theological thinking that happens within those structures. In other words, I can say that the kinds of conversations that are happening within theological education now are powerful, and they're inclusive, and they are multi-generational and multi-ethnic and multi-racial and expansive of gender identities and sexual identities. Those conversations are happening. Why can't our structures mirror or align with that kind of things? Because it's hard. And there is a sense that perhaps the house of cards, but I think it's necessary. It's a necessary step. Otherwise, and Willie Jennings speaks of this in his book After Whiteness about theological education, and in that text he shows there is a picture, a painting of a scene. I don't know if you've seen it, of looks like a scene from a plantation in a church where there is a Black preacher at the pulpit, and the faces around are all Black except for the white, I would say the plantation owner. Is there and watching. And not just watching, but surveilling. And in some way that kind of, so the voices are perhaps a little different. Maybe the themes that emerge are a bit different, but the structure is reinscribing a border logic that harms our very lives. Perhaps that step, maybe we have to, that's a I would say it's a risky
Good evening. So thank you for that. Thank you. Thank you for that thought-provoking presentation. My question is really about forgiveness in the midst of so much loss over so many years. So I've spent many years in Antigua with my family, and we were there for Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Maria. So like more than 17,000 children were displaced from their families, and I believe about 5 islands were affected. The whole population of Barbuda, our twin sister, had to be evacuated to Antigua. And our main emergency response agents in the Caribbean could not cope. Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency. So we had to seek help from international agencies like the Red Cross, from America, USAID, and so forth. And part of the reasoning is that our economies are not productive enough to manage disasters, which are going to become more and more. And it's mainly due to emissions that have come from the developed world, to which we have contributed less than 1%, according to research. So this morning in our class, we were discussing forgiveness in the face of white supremacist and colonial history, because you have the victims on one hand, and then you have perpetrators. Like, how do people who have experienced that loss and on such scale of so many years, how do we begin to think about forgiveness? Because what's before us is really a push for our rights. It's anger to be, that's what we're confronted with. So that's.
Thank you for your question. As you're asking your question, I'm thinking about the fact that, I stand here as I said, a diaspora Puerto Rican. I'm very blessed. I have my primo in the audience here, from Puerto Rico, and Eduardo is Puerto Rico. Thank you. And so how should I answer this question? Forgiveness. Forgiveness is lifelong. Forgiveness is powerful, and forgiveness is not a border logic. In other words, forgiveness is as much about the self as it is about the other. And I say that because I stand here as one who has and embodies both colonizer and colonized. I am a diaspora Puerto Rican. I am, at least from society standards, a white Puerto Rican. And so in the whiteness of my skin, I embody that which I may be challenging in a white supremacist world. And at the same time, my body also, I embody all that is the colonized, its history, its status in the world as not having the resources before addressing the kinds of issues like climate change. And so how do I operate? How do I really live? How do I go forward in a way that attends to the fact that I cannot inscribe that kind of border logic within myself, because to do so would be to sever part of it. And I believe that and again, I'm going to speak a bit about this tomorrow, but I think the gospel of Jesus talks about something very different than creating the conditions of this either or. And he does so in a way that does not dismiss the need for justice, but holds the need for justice couches it in humility and forgiveness of both the self and other. All of us have fallen short of it. That doesn't mean that we can be suspicious and sharp in our analysis. That's why I spent so much time today talking about the things that are happening in our life, in our world, in our country, here in Ohio. Why do I do that? That's not immaterial to our religion. And what it means is that we're invested in it. We're invested in it. We're accountable to it, not so that we can point fingers of blame, but so that we can build alliances and do something about it. So I thank you for your question, because it pushes me to say, how do I live out that kind of forgiveness? So that we can be more expansive in the building of a community, a borderland community that is transitory and fluid and open. And it really looks, who wants to be in community right now? I don't know if that has answered your question. That's the only way that I can kind of work it through. So thank you.
That I think some of the challenge how as and that they and we're not and you don't have to do without the harm that you don't have any parents. I think part of the challenge is part of the mind. I think the logic would be if I say I'm not right, what I'm.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for always do this. It just helped me to clarify things that much more. So I'm so grateful to you. Yes, a border logic would want us to forget and to say that that's somehow in the past, and that the past then is kept in the past. Has no, but our bodies tell us that the past is still living with us. And if anything, going back to the climate catastrophe, we can't just forget about what has been done in the past, because it is happening in the moment and it is impacting our very bodies. So I appreciate your using the term repairing. You know, reparation is about being accountable in the present, and not just about saying, I forgive you, and then somehow that letting you off.
So an online participant has said, I am from the Netherlands and my country has taken in many people to the point where living space is an issue. People are concerned for their own opportunities and living spaces. When we look at the many diasporas of the past and now current mass migrations due to climate war, and famine, what framework of justice and land and wealth distribution is what you look at for practical answers?
Thank you for that question. In some way, what some would call the recent, perhaps political showboating and antics that have happened with busing undocumented migrants to other parts of the country by governors in Florida and in Texas have sparked perhaps a conversation about just this very question. While I don't agree with those tactics, I do think that it pushes upon us a need to ask the question, you know, if we are as a nation, any community, if we're saying that we want to be open to those who are seeking asylum, fleeing from other places because of climate or war or economic mobility, then we have to ask ourselves again, then how are we all accountable for that? How do we share in that responsibility? I mentioned Ohio and the need for workers in the semiconductor industry, and Intel is going to build this, you know, huge plant here, $20 billion of an investment. And in this moment, the population of Ohio currently situated won't be able to staff that. So does it mean then perhaps that Ohio be a destination for migrants fleeing from Venezuela or Cuba? That's an open question. But I think what it does, the situation of the busing of migrants to Martha's Vineyard or to New York, it is saying loudly and clearly, perhaps we all need to be more accountable to open up our communities, to be more and not just speak the words of openness, but also live into that with accountability. And that takes sacrifice for sure. It takes openness. It takes intentionality. And it is not easy. It is not easy because a community will change. And that community needs to be willing to allow itself to be a borderlands, in flux and not static. And there's risk. There's also incredible promise and possibility of new things being born. And perhaps more of us need to be open to taking that kind of risk for something new to be.
People online can't hear me. Well, I didn't actually have anything else to say. So are there any other questions, comments, reflections on what you have heard? You know, I'm with my grandmother. There's no need to overchew the fat. If we've done, we've done. But I also want to give us a chance. I think this has been provocative to me in very specific ways because of the podcasts I've been listening to and because we have been working on curriculum here at the school. So I think what I want to hear you say something You know, I'm not sending the curriculum committee back to the beginning. Just, I want to start with that. But I want you to, because we have just revised our Masters of Divinity. We're getting ready to revise our practical theology and our Masters of Theology, which is the go on and study. And one of the things that you said that and Willie Jennings said in the book that you mentioned, After Whiteness, Theological Education, and I think it's, I forget what the subtitle is, but I think it's hard for us to see, not just that we have seen and now we're trying to unsee. I think it's hard for us to see the matrix. I'm going to use that metaphor. And so I wonder what you would say to MTSO. There are several people in here who are thinking hard about curriculum. What would you say about, given this needing to create or infuse or provoke border thinking into our students? Talk to us about some concrete things you think we could do. One or two, just, yeah, fix us. Oh, fix me.
Well, thank you for asking the question. Just so you know, I mean, Dr. Bridgman knows that I'm also involved in a collaborative project with 3 other scholars of theology. The project is called Teaching Borderlands, and we are working with theological institutions on how do we break out of binary thinking, border logics, and be more expansive in our curriculum, particularly if we are to be attentive to, responsive to the changing demographics of our institutions and the increase in Latinx students within our institutions, as well as faculty, staff. And one way that we've actually been discussing within that cohort is how, going back to the question about PhD studies, do the current delineations that we hold so dear within our theological institutions, do they really serve us? Do they continue to serve us? Do we need to rethink the categories that are so entrenched? Or if we are going to keep those categories, for example, systematic theology and church history and biblical studies, then should we think more broadly within them to push the boundaries of them against themselves? So how do we think about conversations, the conversations of the biblical text with other religious traditions or within non-religious traditions? I spoke about the work of Brian Massengale and his engagement and dialogue with writers like James Baldwin. How could we do that? And then I would say, what does the community need? In other words, how can MTSO craft its curriculum based on what the community that it's situated in really needs? And that may be something totally different than what's on the books right now. So I would think that would be the most important, is to, again, if we're going to entertain what Walter Mignolo suggests, which is, I think where I am, then how do we think theologically where you are physically? historically, contextually, even as all of that is changing. And maybe that's an iterative process that has to happen, not once and for all, but every certain number of years, where that gets revisited. Is this still serving our community? Is this still serving our church? And or do we have to reconsider? Otherwise, to stay static and to be fixed is to be a border logic.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? All right, we're gonna call it an evening. I want to tell this quick story so you will know. Dr. Delgado got to the airport very early today, well, fairly early today, with the anticipation that she would arrive here at a certain time. And when she got to the airport, it said her flight was on time, but all the weather atmosphere indicated that probably wasn't true. And it wasn't. So delay. So at about 2 o'clock, I was like, okay, well, actually at 1 o'clock, I was like, we need a plan B and a plan C. And we worked on that. And I'm so thankful that plan A worked, that she landed around 4:07 and got a chance to eat and was here with us this evening. Let me invite you back tomorrow for tomorrow's lecture. Tell you to tell all of your classmates they should have been in the room where it happened, and to invite them to the 11 o'clock lecture tomorrow, our staff members and faculty as well. And let us thank Dr. Teresa Delgado one more time for the work she's put in tonight.